and his absolutely remarkable and beautiful wife, Usha Vance.
The atmosphere was electric, a packed auditorium filled with political figures, journalists, and industry leaders, all waiting to hear from JD Vance. This wasn't just any speech, it was a moment that could define his future. JD took the stage with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. His wife, Usha Vance, sat among the crowd, just a few seats away from Elon Musk, who had been invited as a special guest. Cameras flashed as JD adjusted the mic. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, scanning the audience. "We're at a crossroads in this country, and the decisions we make now will shape not just the next election but the next generation." It was a classic JD Vance speech, a mix of policy, conviction, and a few pointed jabs at the usual suspects. He spoke about the economy, about American families, about the need for leadership that actually listens. The audience nodded, clapped at the right moments, and JD fed off their energy. But then, something shifted. As he started wrapping up, JD's voice took on a more personal tone. "I got into this fight because I believe in something bigger than politics," he said, glancing toward Usha in the crowd. "I believe in truth, in speaking up even when it's uncomfortable." A few people in the audience exchanged glances, as if sensing that something more was coming. JD paused, gripping the edges of the podium for a beat before continuing. "This isn't about winning or losing. It's about the people in this room, the people watching at home, the people whose voices aren't always heard." More applause. Musk, leaning back in his chair, gave a small nod, almost as if he had heard all of this before. Usha, meanwhile, sat completely still. JD exhaled and gave a firm nod. "Thank you." The crowd clapped as JD stepped away from the mic, ready to leave the stage. It was a solid speech, nothing too controversial, nothing that would make headlines for the wrong reasons. At least, that's what he thought. Because just as he took his first step away from the podium, Usha stood up. And before anyone knew what was happening, before JD himself even had a chance to react, she was walking toward the stage. The applause was still fading when Usha rose from her seat. It wasn't dramatic, no rush, no hesitation, just a steady, deliberate movement. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe she was heading toward the backstage area to greet JD. Maybe she just needed a moment away from the crowd. But then, she walked straight toward the stage. The murmurs started immediately. A few heads turned. Elon Musk, sitting just a few seats away, arched an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. JD Vance had just finished speaking, so why was his wife walking up to the podium? JD himself had already stepped down from the stage and was making his way back to his seat when he noticed a shift in the room. He turned just in time to see Usha reaching for his microphone. The moment was quick but deliberate. She didn't snatch it. She didn't make a scene. She simply extended her hand, and JD, caught off guard, let her take it. Usha Vance shakes the entire world after she grabs JD Vance's mic on live TV, just watch his reaction. The murmurs grew louder. A few cameras shifted focus. Nobody expected this. JD hesitated for a moment, looking from Usha to the audience and back again. He could have stopped her, could have asked what she was doing. But instead, he just nodded slightly and stepped aside, walking toward his seat in the front row, right next to Musk. Now, all eyes were on Usha Vance. She adjusted the microphone, exhaled, and looked directly at the audience. The room was dead silent. This wasn't a planned moment, no teleprompter, no speech notes. Even the event organizers looked unsure of what to do. JD sat down, his expression unreadable. Musk, watching intently, crossed his arms. The weight of the moment was undeniable. Then finally, Usha spoke. "I wasn't scheduled to be up here today," she began, her voice steady. "But after listening to everything that's been said, I realized something, there's more that needs to be addressed." A hush fell over the room. This wasn't a simple add-on to JD's speech. This was something else entirely. And whatever she was about to say next, nobody in that room was ready for it. Usha stood at the podium, gripping the microphone with quiet authority. The weight of the moment was undeniable. She wasn't just filling space. She was about to say something that needed to be said. "I want to take a moment to talk about something that isn't discussed nearly enough," she began, her voice calm but firm. "We hear a lot of talk about leadership, about principles, about standing up for what's right. But here's the truth, too often, when it's time to act, when decisions are being made behind closed doors, too many people stay silent." The air in the room tightened. JD, now seated in the front row, watched with an unreadable expression. Musk, still sitting beside him, smirked slightly, intrigued but not yet reacting. Usha let the silence linger before continuing. "We elect leaders because we believe they will fight for us," she said, her eyes scanning the audience. "Because we believe their convictions are more than just talking points. But what happens when the cameras are off? When the real decisions are made? How many of them are willing to take a stand when no one is watching?" A few people shifted in their seats. Some nodded. Others glanced at one another, wondering where this was going. Usha wasn't attacking JD. She wasn't attacking anyone directly. But she was making people uncomfortable. "The truth is we can't afford to be complacent," she continued. "And that goes for everyone, the people on this stage, the people in this audience, the people watching at home. It's not enough to talk about change. We have to demand it. And we have to hold our leaders accountable when they fall short." JD exhaled slowly, listening. He wasn't stopping her. He wasn't interrupting. This was her moment. Musk leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or whispering to someone next to him. He was watching carefully. Usha let her final words land with precision. "If leadership means anything, it means showing up. Not just when it's convenient. Not just when it's easy. But when it actually matters." She took a step back from the mic, letting the weight of her words settle. The room was silent. Not the polite, expectant kind of silence that follows a routine speech, but the kind that comes when something completely unexpected has just happened. Usha had spoken without notes, without warning. And now, everyone was trying to process what it meant. JD Vance sat in the front row, still holding the same unreadable expression. He wasn't shifting uncomfortably. He wasn't shaking his head. But he also wasn't clapping. He was just watching. Next to him, Elon Musk remained still, arms crossed. If he had any strong reaction, he wasn't showing it. He tilted his head slightly, studying Usha as if she were a fascinating equation he hadn't yet solved. A few seats away, someone cleared their throat. The audience was caught between instincts. Do they clap? Do they wait for JD to react first? Nobody knew the protocol for what had just happened. Finally, after what felt like forever, but was likely only a few seconds, JD leaned forward slightly. He was shocked. And so was Elon Musk. Musk, as if sensing something, smirked ever so slightly and murmured, just loud enough for JD to hear, "Did you know she was going to do that?" JD exhaled through his nose, shook his head once. No. And yet, he still wasn't rushing to the stage. He wasn't grabbing the microphone back. Usha, meanwhile, had taken a single step away from the podium, her hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't backing down, but she wasn't gloating either. This wasn't a stunt. She had said what she wanted to say, and now she was letting it stand on its own. The event organizers looked at one another, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, one of them stepped toward the podium, voice carefully measured. "Ah, thank you, Mrs. Vance." A pause. "We'll now move on to our next speaker." The rest of the sentence was drowned out by the renewed murmurs in the audience. The event would continue, but the moment wouldn't be forgotten. JD finally leaned back in his chair, tapping his finger lightly on the armrest. He wasn't angry. He was still in shock. Musk, still smirking, turned to him. "So, what happens now?" JD didn't answer. Because, truthfully, he wasn't sure. The weight of the moment lingered. Usha hadn't stormed off the stage, nor had she overstayed her welcome. She simply stood there for a second, letting the gravity of what she had said settle over the room. She wasn't looking for applause. And that's what made it all the more powerful. JD Vance was motionless in the front row. Still in shock. He wasn't fuming. He wasn't rattled. But he wasn't smiling either. He was processing. Thinking. Elon Musk, on the other hand, after the initial shock, had a knowing glint in his eye. He had seen moments like this before, unexpected disruptions that changed the trajectory of conversations, of movements, of people. He didn't look annoyed or impatient. If anything, he looked entertained. Usha took a measured breath and leaned slightly toward the microphone again. "I'm not here to debate or make headlines," she said, her voice steady. "I just want people to ask themselves one question. When the time comes to make a difficult decision, will you stand by your principles, or will you do what's easiest? No attack. No finger-pointing. Just a challenge. A question that every politician, business leader, and voter in that room couldn't ignore." She glanced toward JD for the briefest moment. Not to seek approval. Not to apologize. But simply to acknowledge him. Then, with quiet certainty, she placed the microphone back onto the podium and stepped down. For a moment, no one knew whether to clap or just sit there in stunned silence. The event organizers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to transition from what had just happened. JD exhaled but still said nothing. His wife had just put the entire room on notice. And she had done it right in front of him. Musk, breaking the silence between them, leaned in again and murmured with a smirk, "Well, that was interesting." JD didn't respond. His jaw tensed for a brief second. Then, finally, he nodded. Because for all the unpredictability of that moment, one thing was certain. Usha Vance had just changed the conversation. The event carried on, but the energy in the room had completely shifted. The next speaker approached the podium, but the audience was still half distracted, whispering, glancing at JD, stealing looks at Usha. JD hadn't reacted impulsively. He hadn't pushed back. But his mind was clearly running. Musk, still smirking, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Well," he muttered, just loud enough for JD to hear. "That wasn't on the schedule." JD exhaled, finally turning toward his wife. Usha wasn't avoiding his gaze. She wasn't apologetic. If anything, she seemed calm. Steady. She had said what she wanted to say, and she wasn't taking a single word back. For a moment, JD just studied her. Then, almost imperceptibly, he gave the slightest nod. Whatever that meant, only the two of them knew. Meanwhile, the event staff scrambled to regain control. The moderator forced a smile, thanking the next speaker for their patience, pretending as if Usha Vance hadn't just shaken the entire room. But everyone knew better. JD Vance had come in expecting to make an impact. Instead, it was his wife who had delivered the moment no one would forget. And in the end, nobody expected this. Did Usha Vance just reshape the conversation in ways no one saw coming? Or did she just put JD in an impossible position? What do you think happens next?